Good morning, y'all. It's lovely to see so many of you here. It's 11 a.m. on the dot, and we're going to begin because the sessions are short this year, and we have a lot of information to share and a lot of experience on this panel. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves in a moment. My name is Christy Anthony, and I'll highlight the hashtag for a minute because this is also a virtual ticket session, and a similar session will be conducted at ACPA, so we want to continue that conversation. I also want to highlight that this presentation had a total of 15 contributors, many of whom were not able to be here today but contributed their ideas and their experience and their research. And so I want to shout out to them and note that some of them may be participating virtually. I also want to, from the beginning, acknowledge that this is an all-white panel, and we're disappointed in that. We did have a colleague, Sarab Hilal, who was scheduled to join us and was prepared to speak from her perspective as a woman of color, but was unable to. So Allie has filled into that role, and we're delighted to have her. If you would particularly like to access the perspective of people of color, we will be making the names and email addresses of all of those contributors available to you, so you can contact people for that perspective. I also want to begin by telling you a little bit about how I got into not working 9 to 5 and why that's become important to my work. In summer 2013, received a great offer to sail with Semester at Sea, but was told by my current employer that I would need to leave that job. And after some difficult deliberations, I decided to do that and came back figuring I'd be unemployed or underemployed for about a year, and instead found that I had many calls to fill in for people who were on family leave, to do some project work, and spent the next year actually perhaps more employed than I wanted to be. Then in summer 2014, I had the unfortunate and fortunate flip side of that. My daughter was born, and both of my parents experienced significant health crises, one of them terminal. And I found in fall 2014 I didn't have the time space for full-time work, but I also found that I didn't have the emotional capacity for the work I do, which is Title IX and equity work. So I took some time off and again did a little bit of consulting work, and then got a call from a former colleague who knew me when I was filling in and said, would you like to do some part-time work? And I really have been in that role for a year today, and that has been a wonderful fit for my family and the needs of elder care and child care, and a little bit of work-life balance as I manage the emotional demands of my life right now. So I want to say that when I started reaching out to people about this presentation, I heard a lot of people saying, oh, this is just for moms. And I said, no, this is not just for moms. So I want to highlight that among the contributors, we have parents of multiple sexes, we have doctoral students, we had elder caregivers, military spouses, Semester at Sea alum, people who do side gigs, and people who had chronic illnesses who found that flexible work arrangements were integral to their ability to stay in the field. So with that, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. We'll go through our slides pretty quickly because we're hoping to have time for questions. But if we don't, several of us can hang out, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation elsewhere also.
All right. My name is Paul Brown, and I work at a technology company called RoomPack that does residence life and residential education learning software, which is a role that I've only been in for a year. So my history tradition, it's the first time I've ever not worked at an institution of higher education in my life. So it's interesting for me. And so I have a very non-traditional, certainly as higher ed work goes, because I'm working in a private company, and so I've been exposed to things that I never experienced during my higher ed career, such as working in a shared office or having the ability to do project work that if I need to do work from home, I can do work from home. If you want extreme flexibility, I benefit from the fact that my company offers unlimited vacation. I don't see any higher ed institutions adopting that anytime soon, but if I need a vacation, I take a vacation, and I'm in charge of my own schedule, and I know what I need to get done, and I know when it needs to get done, and so I have a lot of freedom in order to do that. And it's exposed me to a lot of different ways that I think that, if I were to go back to higher ed now, I would look at the experiences of myself as well as the people that I supervise very differently and be open to that. So I have some extreme flexibility in terms of hours, and then project-based work is another thing we'll talk about, and a few other things. So.
Good morning. My name is Shara Hines, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of Central Oklahoma, which is a regional institution just outside of Oklahoma City. And I come to this presentation with both the experience of having negotiated successfully innovative work arrangements in two different contexts, one as a Vice President for Student Affairs and one as a director at my current institution. And I've also supervised people who have needed, for one reason or another, to have an innovative work arrangement. So I can hopefully share some insights into how to create an environment where people can be self-advocates for what they need to be effective in their roles, and to retain those employees who are already effective, but to support them through either a season or a life transition or a time of change for some reason or another, many that Christy already mentioned. Our support as supervisors is a key facet of being creative and being willing to test new ideas in an environment that perhaps hasn't had those structures in place before. And also a current conversation on our campus that I shared yesterday when we were talking about today is that space is a strong issue on a lot of campuses as far as it's like a hot commodity, right? Where can we find places to put staff members? And so the option of flexible work schedules or telecommuting or other sorts of work arrangements can become a great solution if institutions are willing to try that out. So we're talking about that at our institution because we're tight for space. So I can share some things about that as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Candace Fisher. I'm the Vice President of Student Affairs, Diversity and Inclusion, the Title IX Coordinator, and the Chief Equity Officer at Berklee College of Music. It's a lot of titles. It doesn't fit on a card. I am very fortunate that I get to work with Christy on a daily basis. It's very interesting when I think about the journey at Berklee around part-time employees or employees that have a flexible work environment or a schedule. Berklee was very cautious about that approach, and we can talk about that a little bit later. It was the first time in Berklee's history where we actually went ahead and did that. And they said, well, you're never going to find someone who's going to be interested in doing that type of schedule. And I was like, oh no, I have somebody, and I think she is going to be excellent and very helpful to my work. And so it's been a very interesting case study at Berklee to see how the relationship has worked between Christy and I over the last year, and I'm delighted to say it's been fantastic. I'm happy to talk more about that later.
Good morning. My name is Allie Schofield, and I work at Case Western Reserve University in Title IX and prevention work around sexual misconduct. My experiences with this topic, I was in a shared job role between two departments, residence life and volunteer services, for a few years, and have supervised positions and created positions with flex time, specifically for individuals who are caregivers and needing some flexibility there, some project work, and then working at a small private institution that was downsizing, creating some shared positions across departments and divisions. So those are some things that I can share about later.
So going briefly to the goals of the session, one of the things I want to highlight is that it was always our intention to bring together both people who were seeking or working in innovative work arrangements and people who were seeking to create them or were already supervising them. So I hope that you'll use the panel and our other contributors this way. I also want to highlight that we are going to talk a lot about our own experiences, but there are also significant resources that we've curated online, and I'll just give you a link to that at the end of the presentation. And with that, Paul's going to draw some contrasts.
Sure. So what is a tradition? If we're going to talk about alternative work arrangements, right, what is the traditional work arrangement? And so the way that we're classifying that is really traditional in terms of time and the way that tasks are divided out, which typically thinks of things in terms of physical space. You arrive at an office, typically around 8 or 9 a.m. Formally, you might arrive earlier. And you leave that physical office formally on paper at 5 p.m., right? And so certainly in our work, there's occasional nights and weekends. Those may be accommodated for. And it usually will have a defined kind of contract period, right? So some folks do work in 10-month contracts, which is a form of alternative work arrangements. But there can be even further examples of that. So that's really what we're kind of comparing that against. Now, if we know anything about our work in student affairs, is it's never really fit well into a traditional work schedule anyway, right? Because we often are working night hours and things that fall outside of what that 9 to 5 quote unquote norm would be. So that's kind of what brings us entree into this.
So some of the different types of work arrangements that we brainstormed and are listed here, and this isn't exhaustive. This is just some sample different arrangements, different types that might help you understand when we're talking about innovative work arrangements, which is such a nice way to kind of encapsulate this, is again some items reflected here. Some of my own experiences around like the compressed work week for me was driven by a long commute. And so I was commuting 38 miles one direction and my spouse was commuting 50 miles the opposite direction. And then this thing happened in our life where we had a child. And it was amazing and it was wonderful and it became very stressful because I had the aha moment of she sees the back of my head more than she sees the front of my face. And I can't kind of be okay with that. And so a compressed work week allowed me the flexibility to have time where I could be more in that dual role and feel satisfied in both my role as a mom and my role as an employee and a contributor. These consortium appointments, some of you that are from system schools, I think sometimes system schools or system structures have consortium appointments. Where you might serve multiple institutions. Sometimes smaller institutions do job sharing where the consortium, they might cross over, so it's job sharing and consortium appointment. And so some of these are not like discrete, just one aspect of innovative work. Flex time, we've already kind of spoken to that. Part-time, of course, is an option. Another situation for me is I negotiated to go down to 3/4 time before FLSA, and which I think FLSA is a part of this that needs to be part of the discussion. I see lots of heads nodding. And so part-time for me was 3/4 time, and then we used the salary savings to hire another part-time person, and it was a lovely arrangement. It worked really well. The partial year we've talked about a little bit already with the either 10-month contract or shorter. It doesn't necessarily have to be 10-month, but in the academic cycle, 10-month kind of makes sense. And then some of these others sort of speak for themselves. Project work obviously could be kind of like a consulting role or a special assignment that an institution is taking on. You might hire an employee just to complete that project. And then telecommuting. I hope you saw the viral video last week of the telecommuting scenario. If you didn't, go look at it. The dad in the interview, it's just classic telecommuting situation. But these are just some of the things that when we thought about and brainstormed and heard from other contributors of what does innovative work look like, it looks like these things and so much more. If we all went around the room and talked about the different things we've seen, the list would grow. So Chris is going to talk with us a little bit more about benefits.
Great, thank you. So in our experience, which has been very interesting around the candidate pool, so there seems to be a richer, more diverse candidate pool coming in around part-time employees. That's been my experience. Certainly people that are more experts in the field around very specific topics have emerged, and that can serve all of us well in the field of higher education. Some of the other things that we're seeing is a little bit around retention. As many of you probably have experienced, some roles in student affairs and higher education in general have a high turnover rate. So there's research that's out there that will support that those that have a flexible work environment will retain at higher rates. So it's certainly something to think about when you don't want to be in the business of retraining a professional every 2 years. None of us want to do that. You finally hit your stride, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, they're leaving, and now here we go again. So certainly some benefits there. I would say that the cost savings piece that has been mentioned previously and the space allocation savings is something you should really take some time to investigate at your institution. Benefits around you may be paying higher costs for an expert in the field, but overall cost savings are there. And then the cost of trying to figure out how you're going to squeeze all of your staff members in your one space, whether or not that is a new construction project or some type of mobile environment out there. There's some real interesting data that you should dig into at your own institutions around whether or not the cost savings will benefit you for part-time employees. The one thing that I would say from my personal experience at Berkeley, when we went into this plan to develop a part-time position around equity, so Berkeley College of Music addressed Title IX through an equity system, not through a Title IX office. We addressed it from all forms of discrimination in any protected class, as well as addressing the mandates that came down from the federal government around Title IX. The need was clear for me to continue in the multiple roles that I had, that I needed someone that I could rely on that had that expertise in that area. And like I said earlier, I was very fortunate to find Christy. I do think that if you dig into your organization and you think about, okay, how am I going to get the most bang for my buck out of this particular project, there are people out there that can do amazing work on those very specific focused projects. And it's very interesting. Student Affairs has moved into more of this generalist approach, right? We find people that have a general skill level at various different things in the field. This part-time work seems to really focus more on the experts that are emerging, and we can all benefit from that.
So we wanted to talk also about the benefits to employees. First, as Chris was talking about retention, flexible positions and flexibility in the workplace allows for individuals to stay in positions through significant life changes, whether that be childcare, elder care, changes in roles in their personal or other professional lives, talking about work-life balance, which might look different to all of us in this space, but also tends to be something that a lot of us are seeking to achieve. So allowing that and giving that space in the professional environment to have conversations around work-life balance, not expecting that innovative work arrangements necessarily fix or create inevitably work-life balance, but allow more conversations about what that balance might look like for you. Also the ability to create some diversity and experiences in learning, whether someone is pursuing a degree or a certification or looking at other pursuits that they want to get into. Some flexible arrangements might allow for that to occur more naturally. And then also expanding your network, whether that be if you're working at various institutions or various offices or departments, if you're engaging in different work in other places, building that professional network can be really important and be a great benefit for some of these flexible work arrangements. And then it allows, again, time to pursue other things. So writing, if you're really wanting to do some research or put out some publications, or you're wanting to get into conferences or consulting, some flexible work arrangements can allow for that as well. So there are a lot of benefits.
Thank you. One of the things we did want to acknowledge is there are limitations and disadvantages potentially for employees, and this very much depends on individual circumstance. There's certainly the potential for lower pay and loss of benefits, and that's a very real conversation I know my family and other families have had as we have considered these options. Doing market research, and I think really knowing the value of your work, particularly if you are working in a very expert or focused field, is an important aspect of that. I also think it's important to acknowledge that there's information flow that's missed. There are missed meetings, just being out of the physical space of an office does mean that information flows differently, and we'll talk about ways to manage that. The next 3 bullet points around status loss and challenges of transitioning back into a traditional work arrangement, if someone wanted to do that, really, for me, underscore the reality that there is such an implied and mutually understood structure around 9 to 5 in-person work arrangements. And if you're going to develop an innovative work arrangement, you really do need to think through how will you make that structure explicit and apparent and mutually understood across your team in all the ways that traditional work arrangements are explicit and mutually understood across a team. As people on the panel have already alluded to, and I think in part because of that lack of mutually understood structure, a poorly managed innovative work arrangement can actually, I think, and I've talked to colleagues, result in a higher rate of burnout and stress because those expectations aren't understood. And then I think it can be difficult to transition potentially back to a traditional work arrangement. I'll be honest, I don't know if I ever want to do that again. But if I do, I think it's a question of how will I tell the story of this time? And will people ask, couldn't you get a normal job? And that's something that I think a lot of people have wrestled with as they've made that transition.
Well, I do think you have a normal job, as abnormal as some of our work may be at times. But so this next slide really talks about some suggestions and recommendations on how you effectively manage a part-time employee. So fortunately for all of you, I will talk a little bit about my relationship with Christy and how we've managed it. I think there has been some really great wins over the last year as we've gone down this journey together. I would say in the beginning it was very interesting. I remember talking with Christy before I was even interested in pushing this forward as a part-time employee position. I talked about, here are some of the deliverables that are on the table for me. So I was like, do you think as a part-time person, this is actually achievable? I remember us having that conversation on the phone. I had to have a little bit of a reality check for myself and reset, like press that reset button on, is it really feasible for this person to accomplish the work that I'm thinking? And so yes or no. And so we did that, and we were able to kind of get to some common ground on, yeah, I think I can actually manage that depending on whether or not we're having a regular capacity conversation. And so Christy and I will send emails, or luckily for us, our offices are right across the hall. So sometimes we just roll out of our seats and yell back and forth to each other. Our office suite mates probably get annoyed by that, but it works for us. And so we have a lot of conversations on a weekly basis around capacity, sometimes daily, depending on how many cases are coming in or other projects that are emerging. We will say, who has the capacity to do this? Can you take 2 and I'll take 1, and that works? Or if we've made the decision that the deliverable for this month is a major project, I know that the capacity that Christy may have on other things that may pop into the office will just not be able to happen. That I'll need her to really focus on our campus climate survey. You know, that's something that she's been working on for the past couple months with many constituents and colleagues across the campus. That is consuming her time because it needs to be done at a very high level. My expectation around that is if we're going to produce something like that, I want it to be here. And so that means Christy really needs to focus her energy on that. It really has worked. The product that we're seeing is going to be something amazing. The community is going to respond really well to it. But thinking about capacity and balancing that with day-to-day flow of traffic in your office as well as long-term projects is really important. I'd also recommend that you check your HR policies around what it means to have part-time employees in your office and being aware of those policies, making sure your employee is also aware of it. We also had some good conversations around communication. So what happens after 3 o'clock when you leave? Are you reachable? Is it appropriate for me to reach out to you if we have something going on? What's happening outside of work that I should probably be aware of so I'm not causing you more stress in this flexible work environment? And that's been really helpful. So 2 of us sitting down, having some clear communication guidelines and a foundation that we both honor, I think has been very helpful in our working relationship as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Shara. She's going to talk a little bit more about some more effective management recommendations.
So the theme, if you didn't listen to the explicit words, hope you heard the theme of communication and the critical importance of staying in touch with your employees who are in these work arrangements, or being that employee who's willing. I use that terminology of self-advocacy so often, but I think if you're the employee in the work, in experiencing the innovative work arrangement, you have to state what your needs are. You have to be explicit about, this was part of our original agreement. This was part of the arrangement. So yes, I'm accessible after 3, but how frequently will that happen? How often? Is it really that I'm just working remotely until 6 each night? Because then I should be getting paid for working until 6 each night. What are those things? And that theme of communication needs to be underscored over and over again. Compensation. So that issue is when an employee, especially if they're moving from a full-time arrangement to an innovative work arrangement, if you shift their salary, what does that do to things like benefits? What's the implication on, do they then want to maintain full-time benefits and maybe just take a greater hit in the salary or reduction, and because they want the benefits? For me, that was an issue. And so I wanted to maintain full-time benefits, and I was willing to take a little bit less. I was fortunate enough to have a spouse who could help support our family financially. Also thinking about timing. It sounds like the arrangement that Christy and Chris have could be a long-term arrangement, which is beautiful, right? Yes. Here we go. Yay. But sometimes, these arrangements are those short-term project-based work. But if the employee is knocking it out of the park and you have other projects, let's talk about how do we extend this. Let's talk about how can this become an ongoing arrangement, sounds like is happening here. How do you provide meaningful feedback in an innovative work arrangement around continuing to develop the employee and give them time for reflection, time for that important component of professional development? What does that look like in terms of how do they carve out space within their work for professional development? Do they do that within their work because they're only working shorter hours? Or is that more something that in an innovative work arrangement they take responsibility for? Those are important pieces of conversation as you set up the expectations and manage those. And then kind of those regular check-ins. We've already talked so much about communication, but not just around completion of the tasks, but how's the employee feeling? Do they feel valued? Do they feel like they're making the contribution that they set out to make? How are you nurturing that as a supervisor? How are they following through with that as an employee? They're all really important pieces.
And so when it comes to thinking about successful ones from your perspective as an employee, it does come back to communication. It also comes back to boundaries. And I think it also comes back to looking for synergies in your life. So in terms of, communication, being clear about when you might be physically coming into work, if you're coming into work that day, or when you can complete something. And then if that timeline changes, being very clear about that. As you go forward. I guess I had an innovative kind of work arrangement. I acted as the interim dean of students at Fashion Institute of Technology in New York while I was finishing my 5th year in my PhD program. I was full-time, so you can guess what my bank account looked like towards the 5th year of my full-time PhD work. And the folks at FIT needed someone to take over the dean responsibilities for about almost a year, just to relieve some pressure there until they did a full-time job search. And so I did that, and it required a lot of communication because I was having to fly back to Boston every 2 weeks to teach because I had committed to still teaching in some of the programs and finish that off. So maintaining here's where I am, here's what I'm doing, and being okay with even sharing some of those kind of personal aspects, right, of just here's where I am and here's what I can reasonably do on a given time was important. And finding synergies and ways that I could bring some of that work together helped also out with that. So I, as luck would have it, one of the classes I was teaching was a job searching and kind of practicum course. And so I said to my students, hey, I'm starting a new job at an institution and I haven't really worked full-time in an administrative role in 5 years. Here's your virtual case study of my experience transitioning back into an institution, right? Let alone a dean of students job, which they found fascinating because it just has so many aspects to it, right, that they could ask questions about. And so actually I was a lot more empathetic towards them transitioning because I was going through the same thing at the same time. So depending on what those arrangements are there, synergies or ways that things that work together? In my current role, when I go out and speak independently or do workshops at a college or university, that kind of helps out the company, puts their name out there, even though I'm not going under their name. But it also helps further my work that I do for them. So there might be ways, too, if you're working in a number of different roles, that you can find synergies that kind of maximize benefits for everyone. right? And so part of that just requires a lot of communication, then making sure that you're defining time periods of here's when I'm working, here's when I'm not, because it's easier, especially if you're in an at-home work situation, for that to bleed. And in some cases, that's okay. I take my job because of the flexibility. I mentioned the unlimited vacation days. Because of that, I don't have a problem working on a Saturday, because if I need a vacation on a Monday, I take it on a Monday. Right. So for me, blending in the work throughout my life in I feel like an organic way is actually much more how I prefer to work. And so I don't care if I work on a weekend, because if I need to take a Thursday off, I'll take a Thursday off. Right. So that helps there.
That's you.
All right. So sorry for the confusion. This is and this is being videotaped. Very good. So I think we hit a lot of this next slide anyways. I was like, I think we got it. But a couple other things that I think I failed to mention earlier, I think would be beneficial to the conversation, is some other things that I think some folks can think about the benefits of having a part-time employee, but what you need to be committing to the employee that's in your area. So I remember Christy and I having a conversation on a regular basis over the first couple of months of her job, being like, I want to make sure that this is also meaningful work for you. So we can go into a part-time area, and you can easily fall into this trap where you're kind of passing things. I think sometimes part-time employees feel like you're getting past something. And I never wanted the work that she was doing to feel like it was something that I was just tossing off my desk to hers. And so we had a lot of conversation around what was the meaningful work and the things that she'd find valuable to her development. We also talked about her professional development. So clearly, by her being here today, you can tell that Berkeley is committed to all their employees to be at professional development conferences such as NASPA. And so as Christy has taken the work that we have done over the last year and the things that she is personally passionate about on the road, I think it's a huge win for the college. And so I've had no problems making sure that she's well supported in these things like this. Plus, every once in a while, I'm like, hey, can you bring me along? I'd like to be there too. And so
this is my third conference this year,
yes,
sponsored by Berkeley. So
right,
shout out to them for walking that walk.
But the work that's coming out of this relationship has been very valuable to the field. And I think that's why I'm so committed to getting the word out there and presenting on this information and encouraging and supporting Christy on this, because the work, and I can't say this enough, has not only benefited the institution, but is benefiting our field because of a part-time employee. So think about that when you're evaluating this as an option for yourself.
Okay, some of the things we've talked about, but did want to highlight a few others. In looking at aspects of successful work plans before the implementation, really evaluating the needs of your professional life, salary, benefits, helping others, professional connections. If you get a lot of energy from being in that office space and having colleagues, telecommuting could affect your ability to have energy and engage in different ways. So being aware of what you're looking for and what you really need out of your professional work. And it really varies depending on what you're looking for. Also what your employees and your team need from you as well. And then looking at quantitative versus qualitative limits. So if a position description, if you're working 3/4 time, what does that look like? Is that just shrinking hours down that you're specifically in the office? Is that amount of time that you're coming in on weekends or doing evening work? But then also if you're doing project work, what does that look like? If you're given a project that doesn't have tangible end times, so you're asked to design a strategic plan or put together a prevention initiative, what does that look like and how does that fit into that potentially flexible schedule? And then from my personal experience, one that I wanted to highlight under supervisors, it says, be cautious of multiple supervisor arrangements. So I just want to talk about a position. I was in the split position between residence life and volunteer programs. We had spent a lot of time communicating and working out what that plan was going to look like, being in 2 offices and 2 separate divisions. And then my supervisor in one of the offices left. And so I had a new supervisor coming in, and those conversations had to start all over. And the things that we had in place weren't necessarily going to stay in place. So I just want to echo what we've sort of been saying again and again: communication, putting plans in place, and being willing to have that flexibility and advocate for yourself or for your employees or who you're working with to determine what's going to work out the best.
So in the midst of one of these innovative work arrangements, we've detailed out some things on this particular slide to consider and think about in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of the work arrangement. And I think one of the things in our field that's not unique to innovative work arrangements is that sometimes we make decisions based on the person who's in the work situation versus on the appropriate structure. And so we might craft an arrangement around one person's particular skill set or abilities. And I just would press a little caution button there to really be careful about doing that, because that person could have a life change and need to move on. And then if you have made arrangements around finances or hours or expectations just on that person's capabilities, it could be disruptive to the work environment. So really being mindful of that balance between what's the best for the institution as well as what will work for that person. It's such a key piece of how these arrangements in the Deering process need to continue to roll out. And I think that it's finding a balance point between what's best for the workplace and what's best for the person. My only other piece of the Deering is that when you have situations of an innovative work arrangement and you have some who are in an innovative work arrangement and then some who aren't. So you still have employees who are working in a very traditional 8 to 5. There can be some looking over the fence at my neighbor. You know, I left the office at 3:15 every day when I was in a 3/4 time position. And my colleagues who were not in 3/4 time positions were not leaving the office at 3:15 every day. And so sometimes I think I got some additional scrutiny about where are you going and what are you doing and why do you get to leave early every day? And I'm like, because my paycheck is quite a bit less than yours. And because this is the arrangement that I have with our joint supervisor. And if you would like a similar arrangement, maybe you should go ask for it. But you didn't, and I did. And so I can't be apologetic for that, you know, and I can't take on the guilt of getting to leave at 3:15 every day. And so it was kind of finding that way to talk about my work arrangement and also how to not have it be a comparison between those who were still in very traditional work arrangements versus the work arrangement that I was living in for that particular season. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, you worry about you, right? Don't be worried about me. So, we're going to transition now into some opportunity for you to ask questions, either from our perspectives or our stories or things like that you may want to hear. Remember that we are being recorded, so hence the mic there, which is just good practice in general. But if you could come up there and ask the question from there, then we can all hear it and go forward. So, questions from the audience that you have about it?
Do you have any concerns that the positions that are 3/4 or part-time would have an issue if that person were to leave and you wanted to try and get it to a full-time position?
Maybe Chris and Sharon Allie, who've supervised, could talk about that a bit.
It's been very interesting. I don't have a concern about refilling at its current state. We've had a lot of colleagues reach out to us since we've worked on this arrangement, saying, is there any possibility Chris is going to be doing this in other areas? We would be really interested in that. So there is an interest in the field out there for more of these very innovative setups to be happening. I also would be open, and I think because of how well this has worked over the past year, if Christy ever decided to do this, and this is no pressure to her, of course, and if there was an interest in her extending it to a full-time role, we would certainly be committed to that as well, because the relationship has worked so well. The work has been flowing at a higher level and at the level we need, at a high performance level. So I think we could do either way. My plan is to continue down this path in this relationship as long as it works for the both of us. I do think there is a huge contingency of people out there who are interested in doing this type of setup, and I would also be interested in expanding the role if the opportunity arose. So I think I feel pretty safe either way for whatever happens next.
I'll just add, being in a state that does not value education in the way that it should, I do think that's something to consider, depending on what your budgetary situation is. Because if you decrease that line, and even if you safeguard the line and the money is still budgeted, in a time of budget constraint, that line can be swept. And so it's certainly a consideration in terms of the volatility of your institutional budget. And for me, the way we worked around that when I went to 3/4 time is I didn't leave that quarter time sitting there. I hired someone to be the quarter time. And so therefore the dollars were still being expended and there was no slack in the budget, and that was a strategic decision that we made, and it worked well for us. And so it kept the budgeted amount, and then when I made the choice to go from 3/4 back to full-time, the monies were still there, and quite serendipitously, a full-time position had become available, and that quarter-time person was able to apply for and be accepted for that full-time position. So it ended up working well for everyone, but it was, again, some strategy and some thoughtfulness in advance about how to structure that arrangement.
In my previous institution, that's exactly what happened. The position went to part-time, the hiring code changed, the position description changed, and that additional salary then went to help other offices and other projects stay solvent. So then what we moved forward into doing is more project-based work, where we would go to our current staff and see who was interested maybe in designing an international student orientation session and see if we could find some money to then add on some project work. Later on, we were able to hire additional part-time staff, but in our downsizing capabilities, we weren't able to hire full-time staff for quite a while. So a lot of our positions, once they went down or adjusted their hours, they did stay that way for quite a while.
Hi, I had a question related to thinking about innovative work schedules for if we have 12-month positions that as a supervisor we feel like could probably shift down to 10-month positions. If any of you have experience kind of navigating that, maybe when it's not the employee advocating for that innovative work schedule, but what maybe makes sense for the institution.
So I've been in a department that did that, and I think some of it was explaining to employees the benefits of doing that and giving them plenty of notice. I've seen departments that did that most memorably. I can think of a department that I won't name that did that right after hiring season had sort of petered off, and I felt like they really shorted their employees in a way that I don't know whether it was deliberate, but was very hurtful to people, and they felt like they had to stay in those positions. So then they had sabotaged the team that was still there. So I think giving them notice, I think being clear about how benefits will work during that time period is integral. And if you have live-on staff, thinking about how that will influence them and impact them, those are some of the changes I've seen. I will say I have seen, particularly in positions that attract people who are working on graduate degrees or things like that, a lot of enthusiasm for that. And I think there's a perception that the innovative work arrangements might be interesting for parents of very young children, but not so much for parents of school-age children. But I know a lot of parents of school-age children who would be really interested in having a couple months when their child is not in school to structure their family around that timeline. So I'll say that, and then I don't know if others want to contribute to that specific question. For me, the timing and what you'll do with benefits is crucial, and thinking about how you scale back pay, and can you do that gradually?
So I've been involved in conversations where that's still on the table, but it hasn't happened yet. I think some of the conversations have mostly been around benefits and specifically leave and what that looks like. The plan on the table currently is to go down to 10-month positions, but then vacation time wouldn't be available and sick time would be very limited. So that has been, in addition to the salary that would shift, a lot of the time benefits and talking about, so I'm here 10 months, what does that mean? What does that look like? What if I need time away? Saying that I have to take these 2 months off isn't necessarily conducive to what I'm looking to do, and that the institution is looking to stagger that time, so it's not just the 2 months off in the summer that they're looking at. They're looking at someone maybe being off a January and a December, or someone being off a June and a July. And so your professional networks, the committees and involvements, so that conversation is still happening, but it's not something the employees are necessarily interested in pursuing at this time. It's more coming from other sources. And
come on down.
So from an employee's perspective, what are some basic tips you might have for making that initial contact with a supervisor and saying, okay, I want to go to an innovative work schedule?
So one of the things I'll say from the beginning, Sarabi Lal, who I mentioned was going to be here today, actually works in the Career Center of her university, which is one of the reasons I was sad she wasn't here, although I was grateful to have Allie join us. We discussed, do you ask for this when you are getting a job offer, or do you ask for this when you've been in a job and have established yourself as hopefully an excellent employee who can manage and juggle priorities? And her advice was counter to my own, but she sort of won me over, and that was, ask if you think you want this, and life changes happen at random times, as we all know. If you think you want this, ask for it as part of the offer negotiation. You are at your strongest negotiating point when you haven't yet agreed to work for someone, and you haven't yet set up that expectation. So I think Shara and it really resonated from when you talked about the phenomenon of leaving at 3:15 or whenever it is. Once you have set up the expectation that you will be there until 5 p.m. or whenever it is in student affairs, the shift can be hard for your colleagues. And again, you worry about you for sure, but thinking about the impact of that ripple, I think, is important. So that's one thing I would say. I think the other thing is be ready for the questions your supervisor will ask. So I have a colleague, one of our online resources, who's advocating to go down to 75% from 100%, and she's the associate vice president for Title IX at her institution. And the questions she has been prepared for are, what are your exact hours? When will you be available outside of that? So to be very transparent, Chris and my agreement is anyone can call me on my cell phone at any time. He knows when my kid's bedtime is, and that's a hard time to get me. But don't email me after hours. I'm not checking my email. So I think those sorts of things are important to think about and talk about. How will you manage that time when you're not available? I'm also flexible. So a day when I wasn't scheduled to come in, if there's a meeting where it's really helpful for me to be there to get all the people in the room, I'll swap my days around and do that, and that works for me. I think one other point to think about is, have there been things that are ready to drop off your plate and you don't need to take something on? So this colleague who is the associate VP for Title IX has been doing a lot of infrastructure building over the last 1.5 to 2 years. That infrastructure now needs maintenance, not building. And that's been a significant part of her advocacy for the reduction in hours. I don't know what others would say, but those were some key points for me.
I think there's benefits to negotiating from the beginning, and I also think there's benefits to establishing yourself as a strong, capable, proficient employee who will deliver. In both of my negotiations, it was during the employment situation. When I negotiated to go to a compressed work week, I was the vice president for student affairs at a small private faith-based institution, and I actually first asked if I could go part-time. And my president that I worked for was wise enough, more wise than me, to say, Shara, you and I both know there's no such thing as a part-time vice president for student affairs. And I'm like, I know, but I was just grasping. I was trying, And so that's when we came to the agreement of the compressed work week. But I'd been in that position for 3.5, almost 4 years, and had established a strong team. She knew that it wasn't just me who would be delivering for our division. It was the good team of folks who were working with me and supporting the work that we were all doing together. So that having established a credible name, not just with the president, but with my colleagues on the cabinet and across the division that I worked in, was a very important aspect of being trusted with this type of work arrangement. And I was similarly flexible to what Christy said. I generally was home on Fridays in terms of my compressed work week, but that changed depending on if we had guests on campus, or if there was a major student event, or if we'd had a storm earlier in the week because I had the long commute. It was in New York. I wasn't going to risk life of me and my child to get to work. And so sometimes then that meant if I was home on Tuesday because of a storm, I went to work on Friday. And everyone was very flexible, so it worked well. But that, I think the credibility I had, having been a strong performing employee for several years, really helped in her being willing to entertain that. Interestingly, she was a single president who had never grappled with some of these things. She'd never had a partner or a spouse. And so it was a lot of trust as we negotiated through that, but it worked well.
We're at time, so this will be our last question. Come on up now.
I'm curious, since while you were in the position you asked to go down, how did you communicate to your current staff that you had established this style of work and hours of work and expectations that you weren't going to be able to keep up with all of what they may need when you are in a different schedule?
Just really briefly, because I know we're at time, I did keep up with all of it. It just looked differently because I was working 40 hours still. Some of those hours were at a telecommuting sort of pace when my child was napping or playing or running around in the background. But I feel like, in fact, my productivity went up because I gained 2 hours in my week because I wasn't in the car. And I also gained a lot of energy. My spouse was pleased with the arrangement because he felt like the weekends were the weekends and we had life together rather than the weekends just being about getting ready for Monday. And so it ended up being, I think, a win for everyone. And at least in my perception. I mean, I'd need to go back and interview the staff that work for me to say, did it have a negative impact on you that you just weren't telling me? But it was, again, all about that communication, the flexibility, the willingness to get on the phone and work through a situation. And even if I was that being on Friday, I was never rigid in the way that I carried out my responsibilities. And I think that helped it work well.
I'll add, and I'll call final word as lead presenter, but I think most of us can hang out if people have questions. When I introduce myself on campus to people who don't know me, I say I'm part-time, and I say I'm not typically there Fridays. I'll also add, Chris and I have adjusted my work schedule, and I've added 4 hours that I can work flexibly from anywhere, and I've shared that with colleagues as well, because I'll say, I'll be working from home tomorrow, and they're like, you don't work Fridays? I'm like, yeah, I work those 4 hours somewhere in the week. The last thing I'll add is I think asking for this, whether it's in a negotiation or with an existing supervisor, can feel really scary. And I think probably, I haven't been in this position as a supervisor, the first time you have to deal with this, it might feel like I don't see how this can work. And the story I tell is I have a friend, colleague, and mentor who has been the dean at Harvard Law School and the dean at Harvard Kennedy School and has worked at many other prestigious, fast-paced institutions with a lot of demands. And she very secretly revealed to me in a recent conversation, she has spent the last 20 years working less than 100% time and has negotiated that through 4 or 5 job changes. So I think it can feel like a scary leap. I think more of us are doing it than we think. And I think it's more possible than it first seems. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to our contributors who aren't here. and have a great conference. And thanks to our panel.